Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us at another Mold Talks. I have an amazing guest that I happen to know pretty well. Her name is Kealy. Kealy, why don't you go ahead and just talk about who you are and why you're here?
My name is Kealy Severson, and I am a licensed healthcare professional. I'm an acupuncturist and herbalist, but more than that, and the reason why we're talking is I've become severely mold injured through my experiences with toxic mold. And I just want to share that story with you and your listeners.
Yeah, and thank you so much for showing up today with such vulnerability to share your story. At any point, we're going to go into a lot of questions, and obviously, hopefully, it doesn't cause any triggers or upset. As I know it certainly can.
Yeah.
But obviously, we want to share your story, and I know that the listeners will be so appreciative of this. Um, let's dive right in. When was it that you first noticed you weren't feeling well?
That's a difficult question to answer because as I realized that I had been very sick from mold, I started searching back in my mind to previous exposures before I knew what water damage in a building led to. And I have a very specific memory that I wasn't aware of as it was happening, but at around age 10, I would say like my personality kind of turned off. My energy changed. I started having pot symptoms. The doctor said it was allergies. And I just lost interest in all of the activities that I had as a kid growing up in the country, like wandering around the countryside all the time. You couldn't keep me in the house. And suddenly I was like too lethargic to do anything. And that, as it happened, didn't strike anyone as weird. But as I progressed in mold illness and later in life, in my early 30s, realized what was happening, started looking back and I was thinking, wow, this actually started so much earlier before it became life threatening.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting to go back and to realize and kind of connect those dots. And you think you grew up as a child? You think you grew up in a house that had some mold in it?
Absolutely. As a kid, the house that my family moved into when I was 3 had it was normal for the basement to be wet.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
so that was just a Wisconsin basement. Nobody thought anything of it. Nobody said don't play down there. I mean, that was actually also my playroom.
Mm.
So it just in the 80s, no one talked about mold illness. Like this was unheard of to think that something in a damp basement, which is probably so common in Wisconsin. I know that it is.
Yes. Yeah, so true. I mean, it's common, it's common, honestly, in so many different places. So
Yeah.
I'm not surprised to hear it. And I think the difference between today and the 80s is people are more prone to, being on top of moisture. I mean, probably not nearly as much as it needs to be, but definitely more than the 80s, I would say. And, kind of looking at that mold timeline, you start to see like the 90s, there's some rumblings about, mold toxicity, and then there's a lot of back and forth, as you and I both know, and things still are not nearly where they need to be in terms of awareness that we're hopefully helping change today with our conversation and beyond, as we both continue to do the work that we do to create awareness. So then it's a bit tricky because you know um, the next question is, how did you first realize that it was mold? And obviously now in hindsight, you're able to kind of see that far back, but I would imagine that you probably had a large chunk of life where you didn't connect the dots. Do you
Right.
mind kind of sharing that period and how you kind of came to that determination?
Well, you're right. There was a large chunk of time that I didn't realize that I was sick, and I thought I had other conditions like depression, anxiety, POTS syndrome, allergies. But it was really in 2014 when I moved to the Madison area to take my first acupuncture job with my family that things really spiraled out of control. We moved into an apartment that did have this mildew smell in the kitchen. One cabinet smelled so bad that we never put anything in it. Now, me at that time in acupuncture school, I had never learned anything about mold illness. I also did not associate a mildew smell with a hidden water leak or hidden
Right.
mold. It just was not in my connection mechanisms at that time.
Yeah, yeah.
In that house, I started having recurrent infections, recurrent strep throat, recurrent UTIs. I started having hormonal changes that were significant. I actually had a miscarriage at 5 months and had a septic
Oh, wow.
infection. My kids were all very sick. My husband lost his vision. It was spiraling out of control quick in that apartment. We lived there for 5 years, and I don't think I personally would have survived a sixth year. We fled that apartment with the clothes on our back.
Wow.
Mhm.
Yeah, and what's interesting about what you said is like statistically speaking, they say that usually it's about 1 in 4 that experience mold illness. And it sounds to me like almost everyone in your family was severely impacted by it. So that I mean that just goes to show you that there's really no rhyme or reason. And obviously there is quite some serious exposure there, sounds like.
And we even had the genetic testing to see. And I had both the what is considered the mold genes, and my husband had neither. And
Mm.
he had personality shifts, health changes. He had very extreme symptoms as well, but I was in the house more. So I may have had more exposure. But yes, I really think there was just so much exposure that it didn't matter if you were susceptible or not. Like poison's going to get you no matter what.
Yeah, poison's poison. Did it seem to impact your husband slower? Did because with the mold gene, obviously, it's really it creates this problem where you're not methylating, right? And so if you don't have you're not a carrier of the mold gene, it seems like you probably will detox a little bit better. So did you notice that? Like, was it happening for you faster than him?
I think I was sicker in general. But when things went south, I mean, we were both really bad in our own ways. I was more severe, definitely.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's important to highlight the fact that, even if you're not a carrier of the HLA-DR gene and the other mold gene, that it's still possible that you can be impacted by long-term exposure. And it's still really important to keep this as a piece of the puzzle in optimizing your health because, let's face it, we take 20,000 breaths per day. If you're breathing in toxic air with each breath, I mean, it's going to catch up sooner or later.
No doubt.
So this question is an interesting one because it's a lot of my clients will tell me they go from doctor to doctor, doctor to doctor. I mean, really in this cyclical roundabout fashion where they're going to one place who's telling them to go to another place. And I'm just curious, what was that journey like for you? Did you have a similar experience?
A little bit different, maybe, because I have more of an inherent independence with my healthcare. Being an acupuncturist and herbalist, I tend to treat a lot of things at home anyways, unless it's like a life-threatening emergency, a broken bone or an infection that I can't quell. So I didn't seek a lot of outside care, except for when I would have like the urinary tract infections, I would go get antibiotics.
Right.
But what I did do was normalize my symptoms. So, like the extreme fatigue, I was like, oh gosh, I'm so lazy. And I'd like beat myself up over that. The depression and anxiety from the environment, I would like kind of blame myself for poor mental health. So I internalized and normalized so many of the symptoms and also tried to self treat. But how I started putting the pieces together was I actually had listened to a podcast by another herbalist, and they told a story about a woman having seizures while in mold. But the part that caught my attention was she was having marital trouble
Hmm.
because the relationship dynamic between my husband and I had changed so significantly that I was starting to feel like, did he trick me into marrying him? Because this is just not the person that I married. Mind you, at this point, I don't know that I'm in mold or that mold can change people's personalities. So mold got on
Sure.
my radar because of that podcast. And in our bedroom, there had been a water leak from upstairs. We were renters at the time from the upstairs apartment. And so I still wasn't really connecting the kitchen because that was probably the hot spot. But I kept looking at that water stain and thinking, is this why we're fighting? Is this why we're fighting? And that was just in the back of my mind for months until my health took a devastating turn.
Yeah, and I don't mean to get too personal, but I can tell you from experience, in talking to so many people, there's always this struggle. Sometimes it's the husband, sometimes it's the wife, but there's always this marital struggle where one person really fails to understand what the other person's going through. And the other aspect of that is kind of like this denial that it's possible that something like mold can cause this. Do you mind sharing some of the marital struggles that you had? Because I know that it's something that's common, and I think a lot of people can really receive value from that if you're willing to share.
Absolutely. I talk about this a lot because I want people to know that their partners aren't crazy and that this is how awful environmental illness is. So it just started with increased anger slowly, which over time turned into rage, which over time turned into I'd be sick to my stomach when he'd come home from work because I just knew every sound, every noise the kids made, every breath was going to make him angry. I remember one day he came home from work and just the look in his eyes, he just looked like a wild animal. I could tell he was just like level 10 angry about everything. And I just remember scanning the apartment and looking at where each one of my three kids was and which door was closest, either the patio door or the door behind me, because I had an eye on him and an eye on how I was going to grab everyone and get out because I was so scared of how he looked. He looked like a completely different person and he was just raging about everything. And I remember there were times that he would snap on the kids about the smallest things where I would just go in one of their bedrooms with them and play games for the rest of the night just to keep everyone, one, away from him and two, protected away from him. And I remember nights where we'd put the kids in bed and I would literally like cry at the kitchen table, like sobbing. And I would be like, you have to take a look at this anger issue you have. It's like destroying the kids. It's destroying me. I was so terrified my kids were going to grow up to be like abusive because of the
Yeah.
anger that they witnessed. And I just remember him just like at the table, just an unrecognizable version of himself where it was like, I could not connect to him. I could not connect to him. Like he couldn't hear me. He couldn't see me. It was like some part of his brain had just completely shut down. And that's when I started to think, I must have started to get a little paranoid at some point too, because I started to think he tricked me into marrying him. Like he completely pretended to be someone else entirely because this is an unrecognizable version of my husband. And I had actually given our marriage in my head a 12-month timeline of this is when I'm leaving if things don't change, because I had decided that there was no way I could raise kids like that.
Right.
And so, I was like still pleading with him to connect and hear me and like look at his behavior, which now I realize why he couldn't see it. His brain that was one of his symptoms, an inability to connect and his brain just completely shutting down. And he's since turned back on since we've gotten out of the mold. Luckily, we got out soon after it got that bad. Well,
Oh,
we
that's
kind of got
that's
out.
yeah, no, that's really good that it got out, and kind of a testament to this whole thing. Did he start to realize that like when he got out, did he start to realize like, holy crap, I wasn't myself for this time period?
Only in hindsight, yes. Only
Yeah,
after he got out and started to turn back on was
yeah,
he able to look back and be like, wow, that was so serious. That was like
yeah.
such a big problem. I can't believe this happened.
Yeah, no, that's a really, I mean, I'm sorry that you guys went through that. I know that's not an easy time frame to think
Right.
back on. What how did well, let me ask you this. Was he in denial at the time that there was water damage and there was all these issues that were leading to both of your guys' health decline at the time?
I don't think either one of us at that time was still connecting like the mildew smell to hidden water damage. But I think part of him, so this is where it's weird, is because there was this tiny part of him that did know that mold was there because I remember the day that he found it. The day that he found it, it was it was in that same time period where I was describing how his face and his eyes were all different. But it was a very early Saturday morning. He took the garbage out and he came in and he went into the kitchen, and all I heard was stuff breaking, getting torn apart. And I hear him yell, "Aha, I found you." And I was like, "What on earth are you talking about?" And I went into the kitchen and he had the dishwasher ripped out of the wall and he had the linoleum picked up off of the floor. And under the kitchen cabinetry was just slimy, black, wet mold and a
Wow.
leaking wall from the dishwasher. And just those words, "Ha, I found you." Just, I've never forgotten that because it makes me feel like there was a part of him that knew something was there making us sick because he literally was talking to it when he found it,
Yeah. No,
which is
no,
weird.
that's some intuition right there. Well, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. I think so many others that listen can relate to that kind of inner struggle. It's difficult, right? Mold literally causes some interesting things on the mental health spectrum, and then obviously the physical effects of it as well. It's not easy to deal with both physically and mentally, and that can definitely drive a wedge in a marriage. So thank you for sharing that. What were your symptoms? And we talked about a couple, but if you don't mind just kind of throwing them all together from what you remember. um,
Absolutely, sure. As a kid in a damp building, it was just low energy and dizziness upon standing, like pot symptoms, allergies. But in that apartment specifically, I started getting UTIs regularly every 2, 3 months. I started getting recurrent strep throat. My cycles stopped. So my blood flow really changed in a way that was unhealthy. My personality changed. I became hyperreactive to any stress. Like the smallest thing felt like an emergency for me. At one point, well, at a couple points, but at one point in this apartment, I started losing the ability to finish sentences. So I wouldn't know what I was saying as I would say it. I would have trouble physically leaving that apartment prior to us knowing that there was mold in it. I would be so confused and so brain fogged trying to go to work and pack up my younger kids to go to the sitters. I can still see myself circling around the kitchen table trying to remember what I was looking for to even finish my plan to walk out the house. And just leaving to go somewhere started to be like an hour long situation of confusion of what am I doing? Where am I at in this process? Because I couldn't stay focused on something for more than like 10 or 15 seconds. And it just all started happening so slowly over time that I never had a moment to think to myself, like, there's an emergency here that you're not able to leave the house in a timely manner. Like, what's
yeah.
happening? I remember thinking about it, later and thinking about it as being a fish in a fishbowl. Like all I could do was kind of swim in circles. And that's really how it felt. I felt magnetized to and confused to that area.
Yeah, it makes sense. And that, to really highlight that, right? It's not like the severity of this is so crazy because it's not like, you left your house and you forgot your wallet. Like this is like, really life altering the brain fog that you can't really recover from. To put that blankly, that it took you an hour to leave, I mean, that is an emergency, like you said. I mean, it's, what if you got to pick somebody up and they're, it's not a good situation. So just wanted to really stress that because it's totally different than, just, oh, I forgot my wallet at home or whatnot. And just to really kind of drive home the severity of that forgetfulness. um, how did it impact your, I mean, obviously we just kind of dove into that, but how did it impact your ability to just live normal life?
In every way. I mean, I couldn't be the parent that I wanted to be because I was raging on my kids. I couldn't function the way that I wanted to because I was confused. I couldn't connect with my husband. I mean, it really affected me in every single way of functioning. There wasn't an aspect of my life that was not affected.
Yeah, so life just wasn't normal to begin with during that time period.
No, but it just, I mean, it all escalated out of control, but it just, when you're in it, you don't, I just thought, oh, wow, I suddenly have an anger problem. Oh, wow. And I never even reflected while I was in it. I don't think I was capable of to be self-aware of even noticing that it was consistently taking me too long to leave.
And on top of that, you're not totally sure what the root cause is at this time either, which I'm sure has another set of stressors on the mental health side of things, right? Because this is kind of where anxiety is born out of, depression, where that sense of hopelessness is. Do you have, yeah, anything that you can share in regards to like how it impacted your mental health?
I mean, I have such a long history of being inside damp buildings that I just thought that I was always depressed and anxious. I think my mental health has been affected by mold for probably about 18 years, and I normalized it as just thinking that I had mental health issues. Once it got to the point where brain fog was so intense that I couldn't function, if you would have asked me if I was sick, I think I would have said no, because there was no connecting what was happening. I was not aware that I had a problem. I was not aware of any of this. Like, if you would have said, "Hey, are you having trouble leaving the house?" I probably wouldn't have been able to tell you yes, because I just would have said, "Well, yeah, it's stressful to leave the house with two little kids." Like, I had
Yeah.
fully normalized all of this. It was only in getting away and looking back at how abnormally I was functioning that I was able to see it. I was not able to see the decline as it happened or have any awareness how far I had gone.
Yeah, and it's like it can be such a slow degradation that you don't. It's like I try to put this together. It's kind of like gaining or losing weight. Like it usually happens at such a slow decline that it isn't until months later that you look back and say, "Oh yeah, I did put on a few pounds, or I did lose a few pounds." And in this, with this, you're having your physical aspects and mental aspects deteriorating ever so slightly, that it just feels normal. It just feels like one day goes into the next day, until go, holy crap, something is off here. And kind of brings me to the next point. What was the journey like as you mentioned earlier your husband finally found some mold there. What was the journey like as you started to kind of grapple with this and realize that air quality is integral to your health and well-being? Did you start to put yourself on protocols? Did you start remediating? What was kind of the next steps for you guys?
So we found the mold. Prior to that, I had completely lost the ability to urinate. So basically, the last UTI, urinary tract infection, that I had progressed into a complete inability to urinate. And so, as a Chinese medicine herbalist, we don't have protocols, but we have herbal formulas based on symptomology. So I began treating myself for like dampness accumulating in my kidneys and restored my urine flow and passed tons of kidney stones, got rid of the infection. The management company came in when we reported the mold. We were not at all aware of how poorly this was going to be handled or the dangers that could come from mold not being properly addressed in a rental. They came in and they sprayed fungicide all over everything, the subfloor, under the cabinets. They just doused fungicide and just left it and said, like, okay, you're good. So they left everything in there and just doused it. We got very sick after that, way worse. And I had told my husband, I think we have to get out of here. The mold is making me really sick and everyone's getting worse. My kids were getting worse. I was getting worse. We were fighting more. And then one night I had what I can only describe as a phlegm seizure. I don't know what it was. I don't know what happened. I couldn't walk. I couldn't talk. I was ice cold, shaking, vomiting. I was incapacitated. And my husband at that point, he saw me not able to walk, talk, function. I was just shaking, just shaking. So he literally carried me into the car in his arms, and we went to a hotel, and we never went back to that apartment. Like that, him seeing me like that was enough for him to say, okay, she's right. And we left that apartment and everything in it. We moved to a townhouse literally right across the street. We could see our old apartment building every day, just looking across the street. What we didn't know about that rental was that it had endured water damage 10 years prior to that, and the landlord had just basically put new trim on and painted the walls and called it a day. So we didn't know that we went from a building with active growing hidden live mold to hidden old dead mold. And so I had made some recovery with the herbal formulas that I was using, improving my bladder and kidney function. I was taking high doses of hemp oil, which was helping my neurological issues and my memory. I was on some things to restore my cycle, some raw red root tinctures that was really detoxifying for my blood and helped kind of clean things out. And I didn't know initially that we were inside of a townhouse with hidden mold. So I thought we were recovering slowly because we still had some symptoms. I just thought, well, this is going to be a really slow recovery. My husband and I were getting along enough to be able to look back and say how bad it was in that other house, but we were still having so many more fights than we do now. And not thinking, well, there could be something here too. We were thinking,
Yeah.
I was thinking we were just recovering slowly. We had lived there for about a year when the dishwasher leaked, pulled the dishwasher out. And when we pulled the dishwasher out to pull up the vinyl flooring, we found on the other side of the kitchen, not related to the current dishwasher leak, that some linoleum had been eaten through from mold on the subfloor. And I started looking around, and I could put together that this vinyl floor had been laid on top of an old linoleum floor, and it was just high enough where you couldn't see the water warping on the cabinets.
Wow.
So I had kind of uncovered this hidden water damage. My husband and I, not knowing that you need to have procedures in place before you start digging into mold, we recklessly and dangerously took a crowbar to the cabinets to find what was in there, and took a knife to the linoleum to lift it up and see that patch of dead mold sitting there. When we reported it to, so once we realized what was there, we got the kids out of there like that day. I called my mom and I was like, I have an emergency. Please take the kids, get them out of this house. Luckily, she had off work because of quarantine. Everything was shut down, so we had support there to get the kids out safely. I reported this to the landlords, and that's when I realized the corruption that's really in these industries. They had a mold inspector come out with a moisture meter, and they told us nothing that we found was mold, that it was all dirt. They told us they wanted to put sealant over it. They told us they didn't have to really remove anything or fix anything, that they could just kind of paint over this and it would be fine. I had done enough research up to that point to know how dangerous and how wrong they were. So I immediately stopped all action and I took surface samples of all the areas that I found. And then I sent them the reports showing them that it was actually Chaetomium, Stachybotrys.
Not just dirt.
And so that resulted in just a war with my landlords. And at the end of the day, they did make some repairs, but they wouldn't stop the water intrusion from the leaking roof. And at a certain point, they just ended our lease with a 24-hour notice because they didn't want to make the full repairs to stop the leaks in the building. And that's how that was handled.
Wow. It's we deal with two types of issues here in our society. One is just people not knowing better, and the other is people maybe knowing better, but not wanting to actually deal with it properly. And I think between those two things, it creates this perfect storm that's led to this health decline that we're dealing with. coupled with climate change and the frequency of flooding and hurricanes and things like that, you're looking at, potentially more and more water damage, more and more impacted homes and buildings that allows, these types of scenarios to exist. Society is really an issue. I think there's, the people that are corrupt. Like I've dealt with a lot of those guys where I sat across the table from them and they're telling me that, it's no big deal. It's not that much mold, and the results are exaggerated as if that were possible. But then you've also just had people that genuinely think that doing an air test in the center of the room is all they need to do to identify a problem, or visual inspections are fine. And it's pretty crazy out there, in all honesty. And it's definitely something I'm passionate about, is kind of correcting the record, educating people to kind of advocate for their own health, to know that some of these people are not as expert as they say they are, things like that, because at the end of the day we all need better answers to these problems. It shouldn't, what you've gone through shouldn't be the norm. I want to get to kind of better pastures here. And I want to ask, when did you finally start feeling better?
Mm-hmm. I would say in the past 8 months, I've made the most progress.
Awesome.
Yep.
And so just to kind of tie the timeline in, obviously we know in hindsight, as a kid, you were exposed and stuff like that. But just you started feeling better in the past 8 months. Let's talk about the most recent exposure. You had a situation where you moved out of not only an apartment into a townhouse, but then that had an issue. So how long ago was that?
So we left the apartment with the mold under the kitchen in March of 2019. I started getting really sick about July 2018, found the mold March 2019, moved out like 15 or 20 days after. Then we were in the townhouse with hidden mold. We lived there until, we found the mold February 2020. By July 2020, it had been condemned. And then we were actually temporarily homeless for like 8 months, and we were living in an apartment with my mom before we bought this house that we're in. And that apartment had some hidden mold that I was exposed to. And I also went through the intensification process there, which was awful. And then coming into this house has been the past 8 months that we've lived here. And this is the most I've reclaimed my health, probably in years. This is the best my energy's been, the best my mood has been, the healthiest I've been in probably at least, I honestly can't even tell you how long.
That's amazing. Well, I'm obviously glad that these past 8 months have been, a breath of fresh air, pun intended, and it's allowed you that ability to heal. And I'm glad you found a place that you're calling your own, and it's a place that you're actually healing in, which I'm sure there's no better exciting feeling than that. Just kind of closing this out with, now that you've been through literally the ringer, you've come out the other side, you're on that path back to health. What would you recommend to someone in a similar situation? If there was one thing you can recommend to them, what would it be?
Always associate past water damage with possible mold growth. And if you're sick, the first thing that you should look to if you're chronically sick is something in your environment, because it's been normalized to think that it's a disease or something else. And so many of these chronic illnesses have an intimate environmental component, and I don't think people realize that. And it doesn't matter about your genetics. These aren't genetic disorders. These are environmental disorders causing genetic activation problems with your health.
So, kind of wrapping this up. I mean, you've been through this incredible journey. You've obviously decided that you want this out there. You don't want people to suffer in the same way you did. Obviously, I really appreciate everything that you're doing now. Would love for people to understand, kind of what you're doing today. how you've actually led this tragedy to empower you to turn around and help others. And we had a podcast for those that are watching that may have listened to the one that we just did with Alicia as well. You're also part of Exposing Mold. So, if you don't mind just kind of letting people know how you decided to close the gap on that journey and have it empower you. And then also, how can people connect with you if they're looking to connect? Maybe they've gone through similar challenges and just are looking for a friend.
Sure. So one really awesome thing that's come of this is I did start my own private label of herbs for things that worked well with me. And also my insight and experience has made me a really great support for people who need help recovering, because I understand hypersensitivity and contamination where, well, I think a lot of people enduring this don't. It also did lead to the development of Exposing Mold. I started that Facebook page just a few weeks before we exposed mold inside of the townhouse. And I thought it was so interesting that I started that page and then literally exposed mold, which led to meeting Alicia and Eric. And the three of us formed the podcast Exposing Molds, which is just a free education resource for people who need to know about remediation failures, testing failures, all of the different symptoms that can manifest. So really just trying to take what I've learned and apply it to everyone else behind me who's walking through what I walked through a few years ago, so that they maybe have more of a guiding light to help them connect the dots, because I know I didn't connect the dots at the time.
Yeah, and for those listening, maybe haven't checked out Exposing Mold, the podcast, they do an amazing job at kind of bringing the science. You guys have awesome experts that join you on every episode to kind of dive into different angles of the science behind mold exposure and water damaged buildings. So if you're looking for free resources like that, it is incredible. We're a big supporter of it, and thank you for all that you're doing. Any last words for anybody? And then how can someone connect with you?
So questions about Exposing Mold can be directed to exposingmold@gmail.com. Anyone who wants to work together with herbal medicine can schedule at healbetternow.com. I just also want to say thank you, Michael, because you are a leading influence in the remediation industry and really an in-service advocate for people like me and Eric and Alicia, who's fighting to serve the hypersensitive and also to have other remediators hold that standard. And I would love to support that any way that I can.
Oh, thank you for that. It's crazy to me. There's 50,000 companies out there that call themselves remediators, but don't really understand the science behind remediating. Certainly, there's one of the reasons I got into this industry, specifically helping hypersensitive individuals only, is because the market for that was non-existent. There were people that were shunned because they were said that, they were crazy. They were told that, they're too sensitive. And really what the problem was is there just wasn't a general understanding of how to remediate for the better of the population, because even when you're not hypersensitive, you still don't want all this mold still existing after a quote unquote remediation. So, hopefully the book, The Mold Medic, takes on some legs and other remediators kind of wake up to this, because honestly, it should just be one standard, whether you're hypersensitive or not. It shouldn't matter. You should get the same standard of care with remediation. And right now, just the protocols and the licensing, it just isn't there. The technology just isn't there. They're not training people properly. So, I'm actively working to help with that, and we'll stay tuned on that, because one of the things that I'd like to roll out next year is helping other businesses increase their standards to be able to help people the way that we're doing it. So I think that'll be an awesome thing to do. Kealy, thank you so much for coming on here and being vulnerable and sharing your story. I know that it's going to be helpful for people. We had some really unique coverage today, stuff that we haven't covered before. So thank you so much for bringing your perspective and your story here. And, looking forward to talking to you again soon.
Yes, definitely.